Gettysburg Seminary presents the Seminary Explores podcast. Conversations on faith, art, people, politics, theology, life, and more, with voices from around the corner and around the globe.
Hi, this is Kristen Johnston Largen. I'm here with Seminary Explores, and we're very fortunate today to have with us as our guest, Katy Giebenhain. Katy serves as the Associate Director of Communications here at Gettysburg Seminary, and she's also the Poetry and Theology Editor for the Seminary Ridge Review. And if you get that publication, you know what an important section that is in the journal. It really adds a lot and makes that journal very unique, I think, in some ways. And she also co-hosts the first Friday poetry reading at the Ragged Edge. So keep that in mind. I'll remind you of that at the end. Just if you're thinking by the end of this podcast, you get very excited and want to hear more about poetry. Those of you who are in town, that's a great place to go. So welcome, Katy. It's great to have you on the program.
Thank you.
So I want to start off, Katy, with I think what's probably the most asked question, maybe, or how a lot of people feel about poetry. Why poetry? Poetry is hard. I don't know how to read poetry. I don't know what poetry means. I don't really even know what poetry is. I think a lot of people are immediately put off by poetry.
Well, and that's a fair question, and that's a good question, because a lot of poetry is hard, and a lot of poetry does sort of live up to that stereotype. But one of the things that I would say is that poetry is kind of like music, right? You don't hear someone say, like, I hate all music, right? They might say, like, there are certain types of music that just really annoy me or that I don't like, but there's always certain kinds of music that you do. And I think one of the things is people just haven't been exposed to a lot of different kinds of poetry. Yeah. And the poetry that they have heard might very well have been difficult to understand or just not their taste, and they just haven't had a lot to choose from. So I think it's a really valid, and it's something that I've noticed, though, is the way people talk about poetry can also be the way people talk about church. And that is, if you've had limited experience with poetry and it hasn't been great, that's how you're going to feel. And if you've had limited experience with a faith group, particularly with a certain church, for example, or with you've only been exposed to maybe certain pastors or certain denomination or a certain style of preaching, that's going to be the way that you might talk about church or faith. And so
it's interesting. I think you're right. A lot of us, we had this conversation earlier, I think, about, even the best, the most popular poets sell just a small it's not you don't see anthologies of poetry on the number one on the New York Times bestseller list. And so I think it's not it almost feels like kind of a secret community, you have to get in, because I don't think poetry is as much a lived part of the culture in many ways. And so I think you're right for many people, so your point about the connections with church, I think, are true. There's a way in which for some people they just think, well, this may be out there, but it's not for me. Right?
Yes, exactly. So, absolutely.
Yeah. But of course, one of the things that we've talked about, and one of the reasons why I really wanted to interview you for this podcast, is you, of course, are a passionate advocate for poetry for pastors and public ministers in particular. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about that.
Well, I think in a nutshell, I would start with a definition of what a metaphor is. A metaphor explains the unfamiliar in the terms of the familiar. And of course it comes from this old Greek word that basically means to carry, like to carry across or to transfer. And a good poem and a good sermon should do just that. They have something important to carry across to their listeners. And I also am a real fan of poetry that is easy to understand. And I think that actually it is much harder and more sophisticated type of writing to write a good poem that's easy to understand than to write a complicated poem. And I would say the same thing of a lot of sermons.
Oh, that's interesting.
So this is just one of the many things that they have, that the process of writing and putting together a poem or a sermon, something that they have in common. And I think I'd like to actually jump right in with a poem as an example.
Outstanding, sure.
So this is a poem called My Double, and it's by Dan Vera. my double. I tease you about the dog's affections. You have his eye when you're in the room. And when you walk away, his ears keep pace, in case his feet must follow. He wants for you so dearly when you've departed. I tell you, what am I, chopped liver? But you are his beef bourguignon. You are the steak tartare of his every dream. I play green with envy, but the truth is, he is my clearest mirror. If I lived in the love time of a dog and thought that every time you left, you might not make it back, wouldn't I climb the chair near the window? Wouldn't I pace the floors in deep distress? So this is a love poem, right?
Yeah.
But you don't hear anything about the moon or flowers. You don't hear one person saying to another, I love you. And yet it's even more effective, I would say.
Yeah.
And this reminds me of the New Testament because, the parables that Jesus uses are because they're effective and because he is carrying something important across, right? The carrier, the transfer. And so this is also not what I would call a religious poem, but the few examples that I brought in are all things that I think would be helpful for preachers to use while they're putting together a sermon, right? You've got your commentaries, you've got notes, you've got things that you learned in seminary, something that you overheard in the line at the Rite Aid, whatever. All of the stuff, this whole pile of stuff that you've got when you're, as Neil Plantinga says, you climb the mountain every week when you're writing that sermon. And I just would like to lift up poetry as a way to help you climb that mountain.
Yeah.
And to say, this is actually an ally of yours, and this is, and when you're reading a poem like this sort of work has, in some ways, already been done, and it can just, in a really indirect way, help you to think about what is going to be an effective way for me to carry what I'm being called to carry this week. Whatever that lectionary text is, whatever is happening in the world, whatever's happening in the congregation or my life, all of that stuff that you're already doing, this can just help you do it in a little bit of a more interesting way.
Yeah. Well, of course, so I'm such a sucker for that poem. My little dog. And I think, as I was listening to that, I think one of the, for me, so I do love poetry, but I'm picky, right? Again, I'm not like, I don't love it all. I love what I love, and Gerard Manley Hopkins and Mary Oliver are my two favorite poems. Yeah. And I think they're in some ways, Gerard Manley Hopkins certainly explicitly religious, obviously Jesuit, and Mary Oliver I think deeply so also, even though she, I don't think she says Jesus in any of her poems.
No,
but
she's absolutely.
Yeah, right? And I think for me what I love about, like that poem, for example, so I hear that poem and I connect with my little dog, whom I love so much, and I think, and like you said, in some ways it's more powerful than saying I love you, right? It's a way of saying here is an allegory, here's a metaphor for how I love you and the way in which I love you. And I think when I'm thinking about writing a sermon, right? I think sometimes certainly you can tell a story from your own life, and a lot of there's a whole school of people that think that's kind of the best way to sort of go about it, tell stories about your own life and relate that. But there's something about a poem that because it's out there, it's not about me, but it opens up all of these entry points in some ways, I think, that invite people to enter into it from their own experience, rather than sort of, okay, well, here's my experience,
yes.
Right? Here's a experience that you were invited into. And the language is so beautiful. I think for me that's another thing, right, about poetry, is that the language is so precise. You have this economy of words. And so, I think I'd like also to invite preachers into that discipline of reading beautiful, powerful words, because I think the more you read it, the more you can kind of recognize it in your own writing in a really great way.
Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Read us another one.
Okay. So this poem is called Molly is Asked, and it's by Ron Kirchie. Molly is asked to be in the Christmas pageant. She tells me this standing in the door of what we laughingly call my study. But I don't want to be Mary, she says. I want to be the guy. That makes me look up from my bills. Joseph? The innkeeper. I want to slam the door in Joseph's face. She's 8. I wonder if we'll look back on this next year and laugh, or will she want to be Herod, and we'll have to take her little brother and flee. Okay, so again, you might think, like, well, what could this possibly have to do with sermon writing? And what you were just talking about, this sort of, there's this efficiency and the way of saying something, in a succinct way. That was a 13-line poem, and they were not even long lines, right? You can read that in like 40 seconds. And yet we go from, well, I happen to know that this poet lives in California, so we're basically going from this house in California to Bethlehem and back. And this is the kind of poem that I think can be helpful if you're working with texts that you're really familiar with. Say you've been writing, for 15 years, you've been writing, there's like, it's like, okay, I'm back at this sermon. And sometimes it can just help to be reminded of even the most familiar texts and the most familiar topics. We still come to them differently because, you're going to be in a different place in your own life, and the world is a different place, and there are different perspectives. And so sometimes I think a poem can also just be useful because in a really quick way it can remind you, like, oh, it's not just Mary and Joseph.
Yeah, right. Yeah, is he the poet? Yeah. Is religious? Is he, do you know
well,
what?
He's one of the top poets that I would recommend for preachers, even though.
Say his name again, Katie, and spell it.
It's Ron Kirche, and let me spell it because it's spelled differently than it sounds. Koertge. He's not an overtly religious poet, but he has a lot. There's a lot of. He uses a lot of biblical references, and he does this often sort of irreverently. He's kind of. He's very witty. Sometimes he's compared to Billy Collins, but he is a poet of substance. I mean, he's really, I have several of his books, and I've heard him read live, and I'm just, the more I read of his, the greater a fan I am. And he is someone who is very accessible and easy to understand, and he's really brilliant at this, explaining the unfamiliar in terms of the familiar. That's what he does all the time. And I think, reading him can help sort of warm you up and let you feel a little more free about being inventive, or about just sometimes all you need to do is take something that's a little bit unexpected. It doesn't have to be dramatically so. He writes about a lot of ordinary things, but he has such a wonderful imagination. Yeah. He's also a writer for young adults, and he's someone, I think this is one of the best recommendations you could possibly say about a writer. Librarians love him. Oh! And when they have kids who don't like to read, like they'll have some, a 12-year-old come in and say, I have to write a book report, and they act as if reading a book, reading a book as if that is like punishment, being asked to like put a sharp stick in their eye. And there will be librarians that will get one of Ron Kirche's books, and they'll put it into that. And then, like, this is one of the most wonderful things. A librarian told him later that they had a student come back and say, that wasn't so bad. Right?
Like the highest praise, right?
And I'm like, in some ways, that's like worth more than a Pulitzer. Yeah, right. Because that's, if you can convince a 12-year-old who hates to read, if you can get them to read something, then anyway. So he uses a lot of religious imagery, but he's not someone that you would really put in the category of a religious poet, and yet he certainly that's one of his subjects he definitely respects.
Well, that poem, that's just fabulous, right? So here's something. It's the pageant. We all know we have seen more Christmas pageants than we can possibly, stand, and they all sort of play out the same way. And that assumption that all little girls want to be Mary, like that's sort of the height, that's the prima role, right, of the pageant. And so to hear someone reject that, no, I don't want to be Mary, and the innkeeper, and then suddenly, then you think, oh, what what was the perspective of the innkeeper on this? We never hear about the innkeeper. And then, so I mean, the point about perspective that you made, I mean, I think that's, again, poets, I think, see the world differently than we do, and see a story often differently than we do. And so to be able to, again, invite us into a new way of seeing, and then empower the preacher to be able to share that new way of seeing. Because I think, I think a lot of the problem, the irony is, so on the one hand, we have people who think the church is irrelevant and don't want to come, and then on the other hand, you have people who come week after week after week after week, and they hardly, and then the sermons when they're making their grocery list for after church, because they've heard so many sermons, and the sermons seem to say the same thing, and nothing about the sermon is sort of exciting to them, and so to be able to stun the reader, the listener a little bit, right, and sort of shock them a little bit in a good way to see something different, I think is really, really exciting and powerful.
And I also just want to say, as a layperson, that I think the sermon is really such an important opportunity. And I know that it's easy to get completely overwhelmed and exhausted with all, the work of a pastor. There are few jobs that have as many different skill sets combined in one job as that of a parish pastor.
Yeah,
so I say this really out of respect. But as someone who does, it's not 1955. I don't have to go to church.
Yeah, right. No, right. You're right.
So I'm also, so on the one hand, I say this kind of with this like love and respect for pastors, right? And on the other hand, I say this as someone who is in the pews and who desires, I want to learn something from a professional preacher. I want to learn something, and I want, even if it's something tiny, I just want to see something in a different way. And when I do, it is so satisfying, and I'm so thankful.
Right.
So I just want to say, thanks for the work that you do. And again, I'm lifting up poetry as just one of those little things in your arsenal to help you do that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So another thing that I wanted to recommend is sometimes, especially if you're feeling kind of like scattered and overwhelmed, and you have like all these thoughts, and as a way to kind of center yourself before you're writing, if you think about a single word or a single image, and you just kind of focus on that, that's where you can surprise yourself. And of course, you're not going to surprise your congregation with the results of your sermon unless you're capable of surprising yourself.
That's
right?
true.
And it's a hard thing to do, and it requires some focus. But this is, so I have two poems that are quite different, but they each focus on a single word, and I think that they're just helpful examples.
Oh, good. Great.
Okay? So this is called Kind of Blue, so it's all going to be about the word blue, right? And the poet is Lynn Powell. Kind of Blue. Not Delft or Delphinium, not Wedgwood among the knickknacks, not wide-eyed chicory evangelizing in the Devil's Strip, but way down in the moonless octave below midnight, honey, way down where you can't tell cerulean from teal. Not mason jars of moonshine, not waverings of silk, not the long-legged hunger of a heron, or the peacock's iridescent id, but Delilahs of darkness, darling, and the muscle of the mind giving in. Not sullen snow slumped against the garden, not the first instinct of flame, not small stoic pawns, or the cold derangement of a jealous sea, but bluer than the lips of Lazarus' baby, before sweet Jesus himself could figure out what else in the world to do but weep.
Oh, nice.
So we've got the color blue, and this is another thing that gets back to talking about metaphor, like the unfamiliar in terms of the familiar. Mm-hmm. So it's important to be understood, but we all want to learn something or to see it in a little bit of a different way. And so if you take something as bland and familiar as a color and you go down this journey, it's a very different experience.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so much I love about this poem, but one of those is the long-legged hunger of a heron.
Yeah,
I mean,
lovely.
Sometimes you'll hear something and you'll recognize, oh yeah, that's how I think about that, but you wouldn't have used those words yourself.
Yeah.
And so when you discover something like that yourself, it's really, there's just something quite cool about it.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, and I was thinking that image, like the cold blue lips of death, right, with Lazarus, and then, calling back that image. I think one of the, this is I'm Lutheran, and so one of the strengths of our church is the emphasis on the word and the emphasis on the sermon, and which is what we're talking about, which is great. But that's preaching engages primarily the ear, right? And words are lovely, but part of what I think they can and should be used to do, right, is to engage the other senses. And so, right, as I was listening to that poem, these images were coming to mind, right? These really strong, vivid images. And as I was thinking that, so of course the last one, right, thinking about the Lazarus text, Jesus raising Lazarus, that was, I hadn't thought about seeing the body of Lazarus and the blue tinge of his lips, for example, and I thought, oh, how powerful that would be in a sermon when you're talking about this, the visual of death and what that would look like. And so, I just think that's fabulous.
And also this technique of saying what something isn't.
Yeah.
That can be a powerful way of letting you come to the own conclusion of what something is.
Yeah, right. Well, this is Kristen Largen here with Katy Giebenhain, the Poetry and Theology editor for Seminary Ridge Review, and also she's one of the co-hosts for the First Friday Poetry Reading at the Ragged Edge, and we have been talking about why poetry is important in general, certainly important for preachers and theologians, and Katy has been sharing with us some of her favorite poems and talking about why they're beautiful and why they matter. So let's keep going with that, Katy.
Well, I wanted to one other example of this sort of single word focus, because I do think it can be really, this is, what poets do and what preachers do, this paying extreme attention to something. Right. So this is called Hard, and it's by Jim Wayne Miller, who is one of the great Appalachian poets. So he's also one of my favorites. Hard burly. The name tells how life was here. I was jerked up, hard, in a deep holler, where smoke from the smoldering gob pile hung in air that smelled like carbide and warm dishwater. Hard burly bullies roamed the camp. Their fists broke my teeth before I worked, clanking shifts of hard coal seams and slabs, bolting the dripping roof of gray jack rock. Hard was that roof rock falling when the mine blew. Hard the dying, smothering in the dark. This is a real hard thing we have to do, the commissioner said, and read our names off a card. Hard even the hard burly burial. They brought us out of darkness into night, then to the cemetery on this rocky knoll. They had to dig our graves with dynamite.
So, why that one?
Yeah, well, I think the strongest, not necessarily the strongest line, but the line that stands out for me the most is, this is a real hard thing to have to do, said the commissioner. So this is hard, not in a physical, the rest of the examples of hard are more physical, right? And you can really, you picture where you are, but it allows you to take it so much further. I mean, this is like, 4 short stanzas. It's not a long poem, but there's so much in this short poem, right? Yeah. We've been talking about the economy of language, and you had just said how this idea of focusing in on one image or one word, how when you do that very, very close focus, then how that can bring sort of some other things into focus too. Yeah. Oh, Katy, I wonder if you might say a little bit about how'd you find these poets? I mean, so somebody's listening, they're thinking, oh, yeah, that sounds good, but how do you find poetry that you like? How do you start reading poetry? How would you suggest somebody even begin that journey? Well, one of the easiest ways to start looking is something like the Writer's Almanac, which Garrison Keillor does, right? And
does he still do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's, every day there's a poem, and there's also some sort of like something historical about literature, about an author, or about, what happened on this day in the past. So it's like, it's very brief, but you learn something about literature, and then you also get a poem.
Is it a podcast, Katy, or is it a web? You can sign up for it and it comes to your inbox.
Either way. And I have the other thing is on the web page for Seminary Ridge Review. That's one of the things that we've got listed in our links on the left hand side. So that's also
nice.
If you're just
take people to our website.
Exactly. Well, if you're looking for what's a quick way as an overview that I could sort of punch around and find some things. So that's, and also. Poetry Daily, also Ted Kuzer has, he's one of the former Poets Laureate, and he has it's like a newspaper column through the Poetry Foundation, which he writes just a very short paragraph, and then there's a poem, so it's also this nice introduction. There are a few things out there like that. The other thing is, if you hear something that you like, you can go to the library. You don't have, before you start, if you don't want to buy a book or you're sort of hesitant about that, you can also walk into, especially if you've got a college library nearby where you live, go into the sort of new periodicals section and just flip through a few literary journals. And if you read a couple of things by the same poet that interests you, then, maybe buy a book by that poet. Yeah. Or also, there are some really excellent anthologies out there, and a lot of them are grouped on a certain theme. I mean, for pastors, there are plenty that are related to like death, for example, that help with funeral writing. And so you could also look up, there's also these an annual series called The Best American Poetry. So you could also get one of those. I would say, first just start kind of poking around, and if there's a name that comes up a few times, then you might want, because in your library with all of your other books, when you're writing a sermon, if you have a few go-to people, like for me, Ron Kirchie is a go-to person. I never tire of him. I have several of his books. And, once you get to that point, if you have a few anthologies or a few single author collections, that can be really helpful. But if you're looking on a particular subject or a particular text, you can just Google it too. Yeah. just write poetry and write the topic.
Yeah. And, see what comes up.
I mean, that's kind of the easiest way. And the other thing is, once in a while, you could also try going to a poetry reading. And again, if you're in a university town, usually the English department or sometimes a journal affiliated with the university will invite authors to come. Sure. And that's what I'd recommend. I'd start with the Writers' Almanac.
So let me just make sure I heard you clearly. So if you go to our website, and then there's you can find the Seminary Ridge Review, and then there's some links.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Because I think, one of the things that I do too, there's like the word of the day that you can get in your inbox. You can sign up for a poem a day, and so I get it. And I think that, again, the hard thing is, I have to say, probably, over 50% of poetry I don't like. And I think it's, and so I'm always, I like the idea of going to like the Writer's Almanac or looking through anthologies, because I think people can get discouraged. I would never say to somebody, just buy somebody's, this person's supposed to be a famous poet, or, even though I love Mary Oliver, I would never say, well, just go buy a book of Mary Oliver's poems, because not everybody is going to like her. And I think the fear is always that you read a few poems, you don't like them, you think, I don't like poetry. Yes, you do. You just have to find the poets that you like, right? And that's different for everybody, I think, in terms of what strikes you and what you find evocative and what speaks to you and touches you and all of that. So, that's good.
That's very true. I was just thinking of one anthology, which is, it's probably a couple of decades old now. Something that I also enjoy. It's an anthology of North Carolina poets, and it's called "The Language They Speak Is Things to Eat." Isn't that the best title? It comes from a James Applewhite poem. And so, it might be something on a topic. It might also be from a certain region,
Right.
So I wouldn't just sort of blindly buy a book because it would be disappointed, right? But if you do come across someone that you really like, then you might want to see where else they're kind of cropping up. And,
Right. No, I think that's good. And you're right. I mean, I think that idea of just, especially if as a preacher, if you're looking for a topic, death, resurrection, or grief, or love, or whatever, and of course there are plenty of, like you said, anthologies that are structured that way too, which is also can be I think really enriching if you're wanting to look at death. Mary Oliver has a great poem, When Death Comes, and it's that, in the sense of, I want to step through the door full of excitement, wondering, kind of what's there on the other side, and it's a different, a different view of that. And then you also, of course, have the poems that really just kind of rip open the grief of it all, and to kind of juxtapose those things, I think can be really, really powerful. Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, some more.
So, I read a couple of examples of sort of a one-word focus.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So another thing, though, that is especially pertinent for preaching is you're juggling a few things and you're trying to make sense of them in a short period of time, like you have, whatever your texts are for that day, and you're trying to speak to something that's going on in the world, right? And so this is a poem that has 3 different things going on, but it's still quite easy to understand. And by bringing 3 things together, it makes they all build on each other, I would say, and it makes it more powerful. So this is called A Difficult Birth, Easter 1998, and it's by Gillian Clarke, who's the National Poet of Wales. A Difficult Birth, Easter 1998. An old ewe that somehow, till this year, had given the ram the slip. We thought her barren. Good Friday, and the Irish peace deal close. And tonight she's serious, restless and hoofing the straw. We put off the quiet supper and bottle of wine we'd planned to celebrate if the news is good. Her waters broke an hour ago, and she sipped her own lost salty ocean from the ground, while they slog it out in Belfast, 8 decades since Easter 1916. Exhausted, tamed by pain, she licks my fingers with a burning tongue, lies down again, 2 hooves and a muzzle. But the lamb won't come. You phone for help and step into the lane to watch for car lights. This is when the whitecoats come to the women, well-meaning, knowing best, with their needles and forceps. So I ease my fingers in, take the slippery head in my right hand, 2 hooves in my left. We strain together, harder than we dared. I feel a creak in the limbs and pull till he comes in a syrupy flood. She drinks him, famished, and you find us, peaceful, at a cradling that might have been a death. Then the second lamb slips through her open door, the stone rolled away.
Oh, that's gorgeous. Yeah, so
the politics, unfortunately, still extremely relevant today, and the idea of consensus and, difficult birth, that's a good comparison there. But the fact that they've, Easter in the beginning and Easter at the end, so you've got these 3 things, and yet, even though you're juggling 3 things, it's still completely understandable. It's not confusing, right?
Right.
So it's still very accessible.
Right.
And yet, if you were just talking about one of those things, it wouldn't be as powerful as when you bring them together.
Yeah, right. Well, and again, I'm struck by, so sort of 2 ways of going about things. I'm thinking this just kind of popped into my head. So it's Trinity Sunday, and you hear, right, every pastor's nemesis. And so you've got to come up with a sermon on the Trinity. So one way that you could go about this is to do the whole thing, big, elaborate concepts, right? As many words as you can pile into it. Or you could choose one little, again, image, metaphor, idea, word, and let that serve as a microcosm, and so I was thinking as I was listening to that poem and this vivid and right, poetry really touches all your senses, right? The licking and the burning tongue and all of that. I mean, that again, it's so vivid. And so this just the story of a difficult birth, a literal difficult birth, right? That you're right in that, but then that also somehow says all you have to say about the peace process that's going on. I mean, that's so much more than if you sort of tried to narrate the whole history of it, blah, 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 blah. I mean, it's just, right. And so, and I think this also reminds me, the best pastors that I've heard preach the shortest sermons in some way. I mean, that's not 100% true, but I think it's the same way like teachers, when you start off, you assign way too many books, way too much reading, and by the end of your career, many teachers, they're using one book or two books because they know to go deeply is more important. And so I think about one of my professors in seminary. He was just famous for these sermons that on the page, it was like a page or a page and a half, and you would think, well, what's this? But then when you heard it, it was so powerful because less is more, in a sense, I think, with sermons. And I think poetry, for me, kind of teaches that also, right? I mean, that you don't have to just pile on to get more meaning. Yeah, that was great.
So I think I'd like to close with another Welsh poet. It's there's just so many.
Right.
It's hard not to. And this is not so much for sermon writing, but this is just sort of going out to everyone who's any public minister, and how that can be both kind of isolating, and yet you're part of all these communities, and yet you're also often feeling kind of on your own. Mm-hmm. So this is by R.S. Thomas. And he's one of the big dogs of Welsh poetry. But he was also an Anglican priest in a rural context. His parishes were rural parishes. So this is called The Other, and I have to laugh when I read this title because I'm also around people who are involved in clinical pastoral education and psychology, and the other is this phrase.
Oh yeah, right. That's right. We love that.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So this is a different one.
Okay.
And this is a good night poem for pastors that I'd like to just put out there.
Fabulous.
Okay. The Other. There are nights that are so still that I can hear the small owl calling far off and a fox barking miles away. It is then that I lie in the lean hours awake, listening to the swell born somewhere in the Atlantic, rising and falling, wave on the long shore by the village that is without light and companionless. And the thought comes of that other being who is awake too, letting our prayers break on him, not like this, for a few hours, but for days, years, for eternity.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, Katy. Again, my guest today was Katy Giebenhain, the Poetry and Theology Editor for Seminary Ridge Review and our Associate Director of Communications. And in case she seemed particularly knowledgeable to you and you were wondering, is she all self-taught? You should know that she also has a Master's in Philosophy and Creative Writing from the University of South Wales, which explains a little bit of your affection for Welsh poets. And she has new work forthcoming in the Glasgow Review of Books and the anthology Down the Dark River. And if you want to know more, again, go to our website and look up Seminary Ridge Review, and you'll get some more information. Or just email Katy. I think she'll be happy to maybe answer your questions or steer you in a good direction for your own reading. So thanks again, Katy.
Thank you.
You have been listening to The Seminary Explores from historic Seminary Ridge in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a production of Gettysburg Seminary. We invite you to visit our website at www.ltsg.org Opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of Gettysburg Seminary or the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America.